Good evening. On behalf of the King's College, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture by the distinguished journalist Jerry Mitchell, who will be speaking about his wonderful book, Race Against Time, which was published earlier this year by Simon and Schuster. Tonight's lecture is being co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience and the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute, both of which are housed at King's. My name is David Tubbs. I teach courses in politics and constitutional law. In just a few minutes, my colleague, Professor Paul Glatter, will introduce formally Jerry Mitchell to you. But before turning things over to Paul, I would like to describe the format of tonight's event and offer a few introductory comments. After being introduced, Jerry Mitchell will be speaking for approximately 40 to 50 minutes. This should leave substantial time for a question and answer. If you have a question, please submit it by text to the following number, 646-355-8946. That's 646-355-8946. I shall do my best to get to as many questions as possible. Now for a few introductory remarks before turning things over to Paul Glatter. Tonight's lecture has been arranged by the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience and the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute in the hope that it would provoke reflection on the history of race relations in the United States. Although not widely known, the year 2020 marks the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, giving Black men the right to vote following the Civil War. This anniversary is not especially well known, for one simple reason. The great majority of Black men who gained the right to vote in 1870 were soon stripped of this right when Reconstruction ended and legal segregation was established throughout the South and various border states in the 1880s and 1890s. To appreciate the magnitude of this disenfranchisement, we should recall that in 1918, when the First World War ended, 90% of American Blacks were still living in the South. Accordingly, a crucial reference point for the history of the Civil Rights Movement, as well as Jerry Mitchell's book, is the 15th Amendment. With that, I would now like to turn things over to my colleague, Professor Paul Glatter.
Thank you, Dr. Tubbs. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to share a word about the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute at the King's College. At MPJI, we provide education, training, and professional development projects for journalists at the high school, undergraduate, and professional levels. Our institute is named after the late John McCandlish Phillips, who was a legendary reporter at the New York Times. And if you want to hear more from us, you can sign up for emails at our website listed here in the graphic, phillipsjournalism.org. You can follow us on Twitter or Instagram at JMPJournalism handle. And, we sponsor at MPJI an average of 4 events per year like this one, where we invite our students and friends to hear from noted journalists. And I want to thank the Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience at King's for co-sponsoring this event and really spearheading this event with us. And I would also like to thank some organizations that promoted this to their members, including the Media Project, the Dow Jones News Fund, and the Society of Professional Journalists chapter in New Jersey. So thank you. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome the award-winning journalist, Jerry Mitchell, to speak about his memoir, Race Against Time. It's a phenomenal account. I'm reading this book right now, and I highly recommend you not only to hear this lecture, but to buy this book for yourself, your friends, your family. It's a great read, and it's a great gift for the holidays that are coming up. Jerry is an investigative reporter who, by his diligent and courageous reporting, helped send 4 Klansmen to prison decades after their crimes took place. His reporting in past decades perhaps can help inform our current moment of re-examining civil rights and racial justice in our country. Jerry worked as an investigative reporter for the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi for more than 3 decades before he founded the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting in 2019. He's won more than 30 national awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship, which is sometimes called the Genius Grant, the George Polk Award, and Columbia University's John Chancellor Award. So please join me in welcoming Jerry Mitchell.
Thank you. Let me try to share this very quickly. All right. Not too long ago, I visited the grave of James Chaney. This is a reward poster that the FBI put out in the summer of 1964. It was obviously a missing poster for the 3 civil rights workers who are missing in Mississippi. And 2 of them were from New York City. Andy Goodman, the first one on the left, was from the Upper West Side. And James Earl Chaney was from Mississippi. He was basically African-American living and working in the civil rights movement already in Mississippi. And then Mickey Schwerner, who was working in the city, New York City, as a social worker with his wife, Rita. And so they had all come to Mississippi as part, except for James Chaney, who already lived there. They both came there and joined James Chaney in the work in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. So not too long ago, I visited James Chaney's grave, which is in Meridian, Mississippi, which is East Mississippi. And this is his headstone. And you can see they had to put supports up. It had been vandalized so many times by vandals. And so on the face of the grave, it has this quote, which says, "There are those who are alive yet will never live. Those who are dead yet will live forever. Great deeds inspire and encourage the living." And so I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about those whose great deeds inspire and encourage us. And one of those is Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was fought in Normandy in World War II. He was also a part of what's called the Red Ball Express, which provided basically support like fuel, food, all those things that the Army, General Patton's Army, needed for its kind of blitz across Europe to try to push the Nazis back into Germany. And so he was a part of that. He returned home and after fighting the Nazis, only to fight racism all over again in the form of Jim Crow that barred African Americans from restaurants, from restrooms, and of course from voting booths, as was mentioned earlier. So Medgar Evers applied to become the first Black Mississippian to attend the University of Mississippi. He was turned away because of race. And then he basically became the first field secretary for the Mississippi NAACP. And so anyway, he was involved in all that. And he, on the same night that President Kennedy gave his first civil rights speech, this was in June of 1963, he told the nation that the grandsons of slaves were still not free. And on that same night, Medgar Evers came home after the speech and was shot in the back in his own driveway. And his wife and children came outside, saw the blood, and screamed. I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. For those of you who are like this, you probably should go into reporting or journalism. It's definitely, that mindset is helpful. But there was something in Mississippi called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which was a state segregationist spy agency, believe it or not. It's kind of had a propaganda arm and then had kind of a spy arm where they infiltrated civil rights groups, et cetera, that kind of thing, and tried to smear people. So the Sovereignty Commission, the Mississippi legislature voted in 1977 to seal all those records for 50 years. So when I found that out, my first thought was, well, there must be something in there or they wouldn't be sealing it for 50 years. So I began to develop sources who had access to the files, and then they began to share the files with me. What they showed at the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting this guy named Byron D. LeBeckwith for the murder of Medgar Evers, this other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting the defense trying to get Beckwith acquitted, and nobody knew that. My story ran October 1st of 1989. At the time my story ran, the odds were literally more than 1,000,000 to 1 against the case that were being reopened and reprosecuted. But Myrlie Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, believed, and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A couple months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet and have to find a box that contained the crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including the fingerprint of Byron D. LeBeck was lifted from the murder weapon. A few months after that, Myrlie Evers shared with me her copy of the court transcript that she had saved in a safety deposit box. And a few months after that, the prosecutor in the case found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet, which sounds like I'm making it up, but it really did happen. I went to go interview Byron D. LeBeck with the killer. He lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, which is just outside of Chattanooga. You can probably guess how I found his house. Anyway, so I went up and talked to him. We spent about 6 hours talking. He was just absolutely the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. It was N-word this, N-word that, and then he started in all the other non-white races. But it was starting to get dark. We've been talking a little over 6 hours, and it was starting to get dark. And he insists on like walking me to my car, and I'm like, really, that's okay. That's okay. And so, hope you heard all that. I think I froze for a minute. Anyway, but he insisted on walking me to the car, and I always said that's okay. But he walked me anyway in the dark, and got me out there. He says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. And so his wife had made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with the sandwich. Anyway, Byron D. LeBeck was indicted in December of 1990 for the murder of Medgar Evers. He fought extradition from Tennessee back to Mississippi. He lost that battle, so he wound up back in court in Mississippi a little less than a year later. At the time I went and interviewed him, he had no idea I was the one that wrote the story that got the case reopened. By now he figured it out. And so he saw me across the courtroom and said, you see that boy over there? When he dies, he's going to Africa. I turned to a friend of mine and went, always wanted to go to Africa. So Byron D. LeBeck was convicted of the murder of Medgar Evers on February 5th, 1994. And when the word guilty rang out, you could hear these waves of joy as they cascaded down the hall until they reached a foyer full of people, black and white, just erupted in cheers. And I just felt, and Myrlie Evers and her daughter, Rena, cheered as well. And I just felt chills because the impossible had suddenly become possible. Not too long after Byron D. LeBeck was indicted, I met with this woman and her family. Her name is Ellie Damer, and she's the widow of Vernon Damer. Vernon Damer is a farmer, businessman, entrepreneur, had a little grocery store next to their house, a lot of things like that. But the main thing is he was dedicated to voting rights, and the Klan didn't like that. So the Klan attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, January 10th, 1966, firebombed their house and their grocery store, and then began firing their guns into the house. Vernon Damer woke up, grabbed his shotgun, ran to the front of the house, began firing back the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out a back window. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs, and he died later that day. A few weeks later, in the mail came his voter registration card. He fought his whole life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote, but he'd never been able to cast a ballot himself. And at the time of his killing, he had 4 sons in the military. 6 of his 7 sons served a total of 78 years in our armed forces. And as I mentioned, 4 of them were in the military at the time, and this is what they came home to after their dad was killed. To me, it's one of the most moving photographs of the civil rights movement. The guy who ordered this attack was this man. His name is Sam Bowers, the head of the White Knights of the KKK, admits to be responsible for at least 10 killings, probably at least 11 or more, and never been convicted in this case. He ordered the killing and never was convicted. So not too long after the Damer family met with me in the spring of 1991, they met with the district attorney, and he acted interested in the case and said he was going to work on it hard and, you know, go after it or whatever. But then he got cold feet and just kind of dragged on, and he had excuses, and those got taken care of. He had more excuses, and then he left office, and another guy came in that knew nothing about the case. So it was like starting over. So I basically got an offer to go to Ohio State and get my master's basically for free, get it all paid for, a fellowship. So I did that, and I was literally in Ohio in the spring of 1997 when I got this telephone call from this guy who wouldn't identify himself, whose name was Bob Stringer. And Bob basically, he wouldn't give me his name at the time, but he told me later, was basically turned out he had worked for Sam Bowers. He'd been a kid at the time. And so, but anyway, he wanted to meet with me. So I flew back to Mississippi and met with him. And that's when he told me about working with Sam Bowers, and just said he had information in the Damer case, was all he told me initially. And he just kind of told how he had overheard, he was a kid at the time, but he had overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Damer. And nobody, that never come out before. And so he told us, it was me and a couple sons of Vernon Damer and a couple other guys. And then after that, he met with the district attorney. Now the case got reopened in earnest. The guy who was the key witness back in the 1960s was this guy. His name was Billy Roy Pitts. Billy Roy Pitts was involved in the killing of Vernon Damer, dropped his gun, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, got a life sentence for that, pleaded guilty to federal time, and got 5 years for that. So he was among just a handful of Klansmen who were convicted in the case. And so I was just trying to track down exactly how much time every one of these guys did, because it was kind of a joke. One governor commuted one guy's sentence and then pardoned another guy and then released another guy on work release. You get the picture. So I was trying to find out exactly how much time he did. I couldn't find any record of his state time, but I was told that he went into the Federal Witness Protection Program. So I'm called the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Washington, and they pulled his file. I'm talking to an archivist, and I said, hey, how much time, federal time, did he actually do? Because I knew it was a 5-year sentence, but I didn't know how much time he actually served. And she said 3.5 years. And I said, well, now, I understand he left federal prison and went into the witness protection program. And the archivist said, that's impossible. I said, what are you talking about? He says, there was no federal witness protection program back then. So what this meant was Billy Roy Pitts had never served a single day of his life sentence. Kind of a big oversight, right? You don't hear that every day. Someone gets a life sentence and just walks out the door. I didn't know where this guy was, if he was alive, if he was dead, where he was. And back then there was, on the internet was a relatively new device. And so I got on the internet. I knew there was a website that you could type in names and just kind of take your chances if you didn't know a city or state. So I got on that and typed it in, and it popped up. Billy Roy Pitts at his address, Denham Springs, Louisiana, has telephone number. So I called him. First 20 minutes of the conversation went like this. How'd you find me? How'd you find me? I'm like, it's on the internet. The internet, I've listed telephone number. I'm like, well, I guess you have to take it up with them. So as a result of my story that he had never served a single day of his life sentence, Mississippi authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. He didn't like that. In fact, he ran. And while he was on the run, he sent me this audio cassette in the mail. When I got it, I played it, and this is how it began. Jerry, I just thought I'd let you know you've ruined my life. But I promise if I talk to anybody, I talk to you. So here's this tape. And on this tape, it proceeds to tell me all about his involvement, killing Vernon Damer, all about his involvement in all this other Klan violence. So shortly after this, he turned himself into authorities. And this now leads to the arrest of Sam Bowers. Also arrested was Sam Bowers' right-hand guy, whose name was Devers Nix. And when the family brought Devers Nix in, it was like the most pitiful sight you've ever seen. They like wheeled him in the wheelchair with the oxygen tank, and they wheeled him up in front of the judge. And he's like, I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, Judge. And Judge is like, well, I normally don't do this, but I'll let you out without bond. A dozen days later, this is like a reporter's dream. This is where we caught him playing golf. So he got arrested. Yeah, you love me. So fast forward now, Sam Bowers goes on trial, and guess who's there to testify on his behalf? But Devers Nix, the golfer. And so he's talking, Devers is talking to his lawyer before he gets up to testify, and I just happen to be able to overhear it. And he's trying to work out this like signaling system. It's like, now Devers, when you get up there, if you need to take the fifth, I'm gonna raise my hand. Take the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And so, Devers gets up and starts testifying. I looked over his lawyer. His lawyer's in his 80s by this point. I looked over his lawyer at this about 5 minutes later, looked at his lawyer, and he's like fast asleep. So Devers kept right on testifying. Yeah, I was in the Klan. Try to put a positive spin on it, like there is one. Why, the Klan was a benevolent organization passing out fruit baskets to the needy at Christmas. And under cross-examination, the prosecutor got him and said, Mr. Nix, just how many fruit baskets did you pass out? And Devers says, oh, sad to say, none. I swear it was the funniest trial I ever covered in my life as a reporter. A deadly serious matter, but funny trial. Sam Bowers was represented by this guy on the right, whose name is Travis Buckley. And the thing you should know about Travis Buckley, he was not just a lawyer for the Klan, he was a leader in the Klan. And so Billy Roy Pitts was testifying, the prosecution as it laid out its case was testifying about who all was at this planning meeting that took place prior to the attack on Vernon Damer and his family. And they're asking, the prosecutor's asking Pitts to name who all was there. And he's like, well, I was there. Sam Bowers was there. Devers Nix was there. Travis Buckley was there. And Travis Buckley didn't react at all. And then I heard the court reporter go, oh, what were those names again? And the court, and then Pitts starts over, Billy Roy Pitts, Sam Bowers, Devers Nix, Travis Buckley. Well, now Travis Buckley shoots up like a rocket. Objection, Your Honor. I've covered a lot of trials in my life. This is the only trial I ever covered where a witness actually implicated the defense lawyer himself, So Bowers was convicted on August 21st, 1998, and was sentenced to life in prison, just like Beckwith. In fact, they just had one cell between them. Actually, their cells were almost, next to each other. And anyway, the next case that I got involved with, just kind of by accident, I'm sure you all know that I've heard about this case, involved the bombing in Birmingham in 1963. And so it killed these 4 beautiful girls and blinded a 5th girl, Sarah Collins, as well. So one of the last living suspects, the Klan did that, by the way, and there wasn't anybody convicted at the time. Bob Chambliss was later convicted, as he's sometimes nicknamed Dynamite Bob. Bob Chambliss was later convicted in that case. But one of the last living suspects was this guy. His name is Bobby Cherry. And so I talked to him by telephone a little bit. after Bowers was convicted. I was just trying to look at cases that either were being looked at or being, whatever cases were kind of being looked at by authorities. And so I talked to him briefly, and then months later, his wife emailed me and said, Bobby wants to talk to you. And I'm going, okay. And so I knew where he lived near Tyler, Texas, which isn't far from where I grew up, which is the schizophrenic town of Texarkana. So I knew where he lived. I drove over from Mississippi to Texas and met him and his wife, took him out for barbecue because, well, I guess that's what you take Klansmen out for. I'm not really sure, but we ate barbecue, we talked. He's like, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling. And he even pulled out this sworn statement to this woman. Yes, I remember that night. Well, we're all sitting around watching wrestling. So I got back to the newsroom the next day. One of the basic rules in journalism, and this is the way we say it in the South, so forgive the southernness of this, but the way we say it in the South is, even if your mama tells you she loves you, check it out. That's like a good basic journalism rule. And so that's what I did. I went to our librarian, Susan Garcia, and I just remember from when I was a kid, they used to run the entire television schedule in these very small boxes in the newspaper. I remember that from my childhood. And so I went over and talked to Susan and just said, hey, check with the Birmingham News and see what was on TV that night. And so the next day, Susan messaged me and said there was no wrestling. And come to find out, wrestling hadn't been on for years. And so I did a story, obviously, and he got arrested. I had heard he had something to do with the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth, Fred Shuttlesworth, one of the bravest guys in the civil rights movement. I know you've probably seen either the footage or photographs in Birmingham of the dogs, the fire hoses, things like that in the civil rights movement in Birmingham. Well, that was part of Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth's a preacher there in Birmingham, and his house was blown up repeatedly. His church was blown up. I mean, this guy was incredibly brave, but he was the one who invited Dr. King to come to Birmingham. And of course, Dr. King got arrested, and that's when Dr. King wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail and all those things in terms of fitting that all into history. So I heard that Bobby Cherry had something to do with the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth, and this one happened in 1957. This was when he tried to enroll his two daughters into an all-white Birmingham school. And I heard he had something to do with the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. That's all I knew. When I asked him about it, he's kind of like, yeah, denied it essentially. So when one of the perks of my job had kind of becoming a specialist on this stuff, publishers started sending me books about the civil rights movement. So one day in the mail, I get a big, thick biography about Fred Shuttlesworth. So I don't know if you're like me, but the first thing I do when I get a big, thick book, look through the pictures, right? So I'm looking through the pictures and happen to see a picture of the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. And so I contacted the author because it was a real distant shot. You really couldn't make anybody out, but I'm already thinking Bobby Cherry in my mind, is Bobby Cherry in this photo? Can he be seen? And a really distant shot, really no way you can make anybody out. So I contacted the author and said, hey, any other pictures of the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth? He's like, there's footage of it. I was like, you're kidding. He said, no, there's video footage of it. I'm like, you're kidding. So he pointed me to this old CBS documentary, and I was able to get CBS to share it with me. And so then we my tech guy took it was on VHS tape and kind of migrated it to computer, so we kind of watch it more slowly and in a better way. But here's my problem. I watched it, but I had no idea if it was Bobby Cherry or not, because I don't know what Bobby Cherry looked like in 1957. I only knew what he looked like today. So I contacted Bobby Cherry's son, who was a truck driver, drove through Jackson once in a while. I said, "Hey, Tom, would you mind coming by and look at this footage?" He's like, "Yeah, sure." So he came by and I played it for him. And this is, I just showing you a frame of the footage because it's hard to play the footage on PowerPoints for whatever reason. So this is Fred Shuttlesworth on the left, and you can see his wife immediately to his right. She was actually stabbed in this attack. And that's his daughter. If you go way left and behind Fred Shuttlesworth, that's one of his daughters back there. And so this is the white mob that attacked Fred Shuttlesworth and his family. And so I showed this footage to Bobby Cherry's son. He's like, "Yep, there's Dad." And he pointed him out. It's the guy with the cigarette, with the white shirt and the cigarette. And he even pointed out something I didn't see. "Yeah, you see him reach in his right front pocket? That's where he kept his brass knuckles." And sure enough, he's the one that basically gave Fred Shuttlesworth concussion that day. You could see it clearly on the tape. So when Bobby Cherry went on trial, they showed this footage of him beating Fred Shuttlesworth. And they introduced the television logs to show that there was no wrestling. And Bobby Cherry was convicted of killing these girls and given 4 life sentences, 1 for each one of the girls. Remember what I told you before about if someone tells me I can't have something I wanted a million times worse? Well, Sam Bowers, the head of the Klan, never talked to the press, ever. Never gave an interview, nothing. Turns out he gave an interview in the 80s with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. But the interview was sealed until Bowers was dead. So when I found out about that, I wanted that interview, and I began to develop sources, and eventually they leaked me that interview. What they showed was what in this interview Bowers talked about, what's the case we talked about at the beginning, the 3 civil rights workers who were killed by the Klan, Chaney, Goodman, Schwerner. And Bowers ordered that killing as well. And so Bowers was talking about the Mississippi burning case, as it's sometimes called, that case, the 3 civil rights workers case. And he said he was quite delighted to be convicted in that case and have the main instigator of the entire affair walk out of the courtroom a free man. And he was referring to this man, whose name is Edgar A. Killen, or as he's known locally, Preacher Killen. So I called Preacher Killen up. We talked for quite a while. Finally, at some point, he said, "There's some guy in Jackson just keeps stirring things up and stirring things up and stirring things up." And I didn't have the heart to tell him it was me. So I took him and his wife out for a catfish. So we talked quite a while. He's like, I asked him if he had anything to do with the killing of 3 civil rights workers. He said, no. I said, what do you think should happen to people that were responsible? He said, I'm not going to say they were wrong. And then he proceeded to tell me this story about himself. When Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis in 1968, at that moment in time, the FBI had no idea who did it. So they literally sent agents all over the place, including Preacher Killen's house. So they came up and came and talked to him. Wanted to know his whereabouts on April 4th, 1968. He refused to talk to him. But the agent left his card. So time goes on. One day, Preacher Killen picks up the card, calls the agent, wants to know who killed King. The agent's like, well, why do you want to know? And Killen says, man, I want to shake his hand. You know, sometimes people see the footage or photographs of these guys, old guys going off to trial, and they'll say to me, Jerry, why don't you leave these old guys alone? You know what I tell them? These were young killers. They just happened to get old. Edgar A. Killen was convicted on the exact anniversary of the killings of the 3 civil rights workers, June 21st, and in 41 years later in 2005. And this is what he was responsible for. Killing these 3 young men and the Klan burying their bodies 15 feet down. But the problem is the hate that caused this has never really gone away. 5 years ago in Charleston, a young man walked into this church and killed these 9 beautiful people. Um, one of the things that's interesting about this is the website that he went on before he went and did this was an organization that's essentially a descendant of the White Citizens Council in Mississippi. It's known as the Council of Conservative Citizens now. So I found that very interesting. And a couple of years after that, the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue, where you had 11 people killed. And then last year we had in El Paso, we had a man who drove all the way across Texas and killed nearly 24 people at a Walmart in El Paso. And he said the reason he was doing it was to prevent the invasion of Texas in the United States. And the thing that's interesting to me about that is that's the exact same language that Sam Bowers used in the summer of 1964 to poise his Klansmen to kill civil rights workers and anybody else. And then, of course, during this past year, we've had reminders of just as the 3 civil rights workers, that law enforcement was involved in the killing of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. Law enforcement officers or former law enforcement officers played a role in all 3 of these, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And it breaks my heart, and you can't help but see the echoes of the past in these deaths. As for myself, my own experience, I have experienced, definitely threats and things like that, and people have asked me about that, and it led to an unexpected gift. You wouldn't think this about death threats, right? But it led to an unexpected gift, and that's the gift of living fearlessly. Because living fearlessly is not about living without fear. Living fearlessly is about living beyond fear. Living fearlessly is really at the heart about living for something greater than ourselves. And that's what you saw in the civil rights movement, and that's what you see today from people, even today, when people are living for something greater than themselves, how powerful that is. To date now, there have been 24 convictions in these murders, these civil rights murders, cold case murders. And it's a matter of faith with me, but I believe God's hand's been involved in these cases. But the most amazing thing to me has not been some of the murders, convictions in these murders, but some of the racial reconciliation. Not too long after Sam Bowers was convicted, Billy Roy Pitts testified at a hearing, and when he got done, he walked to the back of the courtroom and he ran into Mrs. Damer, and he apologized. He apologized to Mrs. Damer and asked her to forgive him for killing her husband. And she forgave him. And she began to cry. And he began to cry. And as I walked out of the courtroom that day, I thought about those who live lives that mattered, people like Vernon Damer. And I thought about that inscription on James Chaney's grave. There are those who are alive, yet will never live. Those who are dead, yet will live forever. Great deeds inspire and encourage the living. So my question to all of us tonight is, what do you want your headstone to say? Thanks so much for having me tonight. I've got a few kind of brief commercials, if you want to call them that. This is my book. It was mentioned earlier, Race Against Time. And this is the nonprofit I run now. It's called the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. And we've done, I think, a lot of great projects. Just got done with one called Poverty in the Pandemic. So we're trying to continue this work around poverty, justice, all the criminal justice, all these kinds of things that are needed in Mississippi and elsewhere. And this is all my, contact info. You're welcome to. Each day on Facebook and Twitter, I post today in civil rights history. So if you're interested in this kind of history that I'm talking about, you can find it each day on Facebook and Twitter. And if you want to email me, you're welcome to. And then there's at the bottom is our website if you want to look at what our nonprofit is doing. And obviously, we'd love to have you donate if you already know someone who'd like to donate. We would appreciate it. So, but that's it. That's all I've got. And let me stop the share right now.
Thanks very much, Jerry. And we have some questions coming in. And so if I could pose a few of them to you. Can you hear me okay, Jerry?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Go ahead.
So here's the first question. You have interviewed some people with despicable beliefs. What advice do you have for young journalists today when it comes to interviewing people whose views are strongly at odds with their values? How did you handle these interviews with people whose views you found despicable?
It's a great question. And I think it's that's what you kind of do as a reporter. You go out, I mean, you may completely disagree and even be, just like with Beckwith, I felt like I needed a shower after, you know what I mean? One of those kind of interviews. That's what you do. It's just part of what you do. And your job is not to sit there and go, hey, wait a minute, you're a racist, and jab your finger at them. Your job is to be a reporter, and your job as a reporter is to listen and to ask questions and to take it down and do a story. So that's what you're trying to do. And that's what I attempted to do. And I just would encourage you to do that. I mean, I think that's the way to do it. You want to, I would say, try to capture accurately what they have to say. I mean, interestingly, Beckwith never said I misquoted him. I mean, that was kind of, nor have I had any Klansmen accuse me of misquoting them, at least not that I can recall. They may say other things about me. They said plenty of other things about me, but they never accused me of misquoting them. So I always try to accurately capture where they're coming from, even if it's repulsive or abhorrent. You want to do that. You just want to capture where they're coming from, and then capture that and share that, and that's what we do.
Okay, this is a somewhat related question. What are your thoughts on the charge that some of today's journalists are leaning towards furthering political agendas instead of relentlessly seeking and reporting the truth?
Well, I would hope that we as journalists, I mean, part of the problem is I think lines have gotten blurred a little bit, if that makes any sense. I mean, I think what's unfortunate, it's almost like we've kind of gone back 100 years. What I mean is 100 years ago, you might have the such and such Republican newspaper, and then you have the such and such Democrat newspaper. And so each party would have its own kind of party organ, for lack of a better term. And Associated Press kind of played an important role in that situation, because they provided news that either could use, and that was the whole purpose. That became their purpose, is to provide what became known as kind of objective news. They were providing that whereas they weren't catering to either party in their coverage. And that's really what we need to do. I think our job is not to be beholden to a particular party or point of view or anything like that. I think you do need truth as a guide star. And where you get truth is facts. I mean, you can kind of surmise truth from the facts, but you have to start with facts. And that's why it's so important, is to do that. And you kind of move from there to draw conclusions from the facts. And people may draw different conclusions from the facts, but there should be facts. I mean, that's part of the problem right now, is everyone thinks they can have, I'm talking about beyond reporters, people think they can have their own facts or their own speculation. Well, everybody can have their own speculation. What I mean is people don't care what the facts are anymore. they don't care if it's vetted. I think one of the talk show guys said that the other night. It's like he didn't care if it was vetted or not. Well, that's not, as a journalist, you shouldn't be thinking that way. I mean, your job is to vet the facts to try to figure out what the truth is. Absolutely. And that's what that needs to be your guide star, not any particular party or politician or anything like that. And I would warn anybody who thinks that hitching your wagon to a particular politician as a reporter is you're heading down the wrong road. You just are. I don't care who it is, because it's not about a particular politician. It's about whatever the facts are and the truth is. And we should be equally tough, I think. We're going to have a new administration, and so I think that we need to be, equally tough with every administration. Our job is not to cater to an administration and to, but to be willing to ask tough questions to everybody.
This is a similar question, very interesting. What advice do you have for young journalists, that is, young men and women who go into journalism and want to write about social justice as a theme? Is that a good place for them to start? Did you get started?
Well, you can certainly write about social justice issues, but if you're thinking in terms of advocating for particular things like that, then you need to, that's more of what I would call advocacy journalism, if that makes any sense. I guess some people may think, well, what I'm doing is advocacy journalism, but it's really not. It's just shining a light, as I kind of call it, shining a light into the darkness. I mean, you're just kind of showing these guys walked around and were never prosecuted. We just got done writing a series on juvenile lifers, for example, and the resentencing. Well, I say resentencing, but not resentencing, but there's a U.S. Supreme Court case on this in 2012 that basically said, hey, judges, sentencing juveniles to life without parole should be rare. And then 8 of the 12 cases that have happened so far in Mississippi have been, life without parole. So that's not, obviously 3 out of 4 is not, or 8 out of 12 is not rare. So, so those are the kind of things we do and report and let people, that's a fact, and you go from there, and people can make their conclusions, their judgments, or whatever.
Okay. So this is a question about the future of journalism, Jerry.
Yeah.
So many news organizations are cutting investigative journalism in favor of web traffic and quick hits. Do you think there'll be an investigative journalism rebirth or renaissance at media organizations, given how important it is to uncovering wrongdoing? And this person says your work is owned as proof of the importance of such work.
Well, thanks. I think we are witnessing an ability to do that through the nonprofits. We're a nonprofit, and there are other news and investigative nonprofits all across the country now. And so we're the only kind of, well, I guess there's one other one that they refer themselves as investigative nonprofits, so I shouldn't say it that way, but we're one of the only ones, I'll put it that way, in Mississippi. And I think it's important, and there aren't enough of us. So I really hope and pray that there are going to be more and more of these nonprofit investigative reporting news organizations, because we need it. I mean, investigative reporting takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy, it takes money, but we need it, because typically with investigative reporting, you're figuring out things that politicians don't want you to report. I mean, that's the thing, or maybe they're trying to spin it some way. And so you want to make sure that these facts and the truth are out there.
So this is a question about the origins of the center, your Center for Investigative Journalism. I think what's implicit in the question is the fact that given your many years in Mississippi as an investigative journalist, as you conceded, there have been threats against your life. There are people probably to this day who dislike you, intensely dislike you.
Oh yeah, that's accurate.
So what kind of courage did it take to start your own investigative organization?
Well, I don't know about courage. Maybe I was foolish. I don't know. But no, I believe in it. I believe, I don't know about courage, but I just think it just needed, I knew it needed to happen, because without that, we're just not going to have it. You know what I mean? They're just not, it's just not going to be the impetus to have investigative reporting. And so that's why we need it. That's why we desperately need it. It's just that otherwise, if you don't have investigative reporting, there's so much stuff that goes on. I know just here in Mississippi alone, there's so much stuff that goes on. I mean, we can't begin to get to even a fraction of it. And so I know it's everywhere. It's not just unique to Mississippi in terms of things that go on that are hidden from public view and nobody knows. And those are the kind of things we try to uncover and let people know.
Okay. Here's an interesting question about your method as a journalist over the years in researching these cold cases, these unsolved civil rights murder cases. Was there information that was off the record or that you were not sure was on the record, but that you went ahead and published anyway because it helped the story?
No, I mean, if someone tells me off the record, I don't use it. Now sometimes what people will do is tell me stuff background. For example, they'll tell me something background and say, now you can't quote me on this, but, and they give you a piece of information. And so therefore you can't use them as a source, but you can go track, maybe go back and say, well, let me find the documents on that, or let me see if I can talk to somebody else who's in the know about that. So I mean, that I traffic in that all the time. Generally people don't tell you something off the record. It's kind of a misused term, if that makes sense, because what they really mean is background. I mean, off the record means you can't even use it. But what people generally mean when they say off the record is background. Like, I don't want you quoting me, but I don't mind you taking this information and going and, figuring it out. And so that's what you use in journalism all the time. You get tips all the time. They'll say, oh, don't quote me, but, such and such. And so, yeah, I'm happy to do that. People know information. Sometimes people contact you that are working for various organizations or companies or government agencies, and they'll tell you all sorts of things. And so, like prisons, like I report on prisons, I get emails and Facebook messages and phone calls from inmates, and people go, how do you get them from inmates? They're inside prison. I'm like, that's the cell phones. They smuggle in cell phones. The guards bring in cell phones, and so that's how they got them. So I mean, for a while there, for about a year or so, a little over a year, I was talking to one particular inmate almost every day. And he was telling me what was going on in the prison there and other places too, because he was very well connected to what was happening.
So one question asks, do you use a lot of anonymous sources in your investigating reporting? Do you have any qualms about ever using anonymous sources?
Okay, well, now we're talking about something different, and it depends on how you're describing it. Now, if you mean you're not anonymous in terms of, like, let's just talk about reporting in Washington. If we're talking about reporting in Washington, where people are quoting anonymous sources, that happens every day in reporting in Washington. It just happens every day in Washington. I'm not a big fan of it. I think there are rare occasions where you can maybe do that. I'm much more of a fan, if you are going to go that route, let's say, you've got this information, it's true, you're able to verify in some other way. That's the other part of that is, people have various vendettas or axes to grind or those kinds of things, or they're wanting to use you. I'm talking about Washington. They're wanting to use you to float a trial balloon or whatever it is. So that's the problem, I think. I mean, I don't report in Washington, nor do I seek to report in Washington. So to me, Washington is a whole different thing than what the average reporter in America does. Outside of Washington, we don't use anonymous sources in general. There may be rare occasions that I have used, according to sources close to the investigation or something like that. But to me, that's even better than some just anonymous sources, which you don't even know where it's coming from. At least I'm telling you where it's coming from. Maybe not giving a particular individual's name. But that's very rare. I've maybe less than a handful of times that I've ever done that. But that was like on rare occasions. But most of the time you don't need it. I mean, usually if you have good sources, they'll point you to documents or other kind of things that you can nail it down with, that you don't have to have. I will tell you a quick story. This was I was a very young reporter in Texas, and I had this working for this little small newspaper in East Texas, and there was a kind of a burned out city editor, and he was a chain smoked Marlboros, and he was like, "So what do you want to do in journalism?" And I'm like, "I think I'd like to be an investigative reporter." He says, "Have you read All the President's Men?" I was like, "No, I've seen the movie." He says, "Read the book and study how they use attribution." I'm like, it was like the best advice in journalism I think I ever got. And so I'd still say the same thing read All the President's Men and study how they use attribution. And I followed that guide. You can read my book and see the same thing. There are times where I would attribute things like the documents that I might not even have in hand, but it's because I had two separate sources on that. So I did one of my early Sovereignty Commission stories that way, but I felt safe because, I knew both of them had access to the record. So I knew that, and actually read the record. So I knew I was safe. I heard the record myself, read out loud. So I felt pretty safe about it.
I recall in the acknowledgments of your book, you mentioning that you read All the President's Men and how valuable it was for.
Yeah. That's the whole rest of the story. Yeah.
This is a kind of different question. Towards the end of your lecture, you spoke of reconciliation as a theme, and at King's this year, we're giving a lot of attention to that theme. It's been, I think, an interesting year from the standpoint of history of race relations in the United States. You referred to some of those events. Could you talk a bit about what specifically has been happening in Mississippi this year? Going back to the spring, the events, because I think most of our audience probably does not spend too much time in Mississippi. We may have some.
Well, we changed the state flag. That was one thing that happened this year. And you had, interestingly, and I mentioned it in my new afterword of my book, is Starkville, Mississippi, which is where Mississippi State is. They were among the places that had Black Lives Matter protests. And there were more than 2,000 protesters. And Starkville is only like 25,000 people. And they had over 2,000 protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters. And the vast majority were white. And I'm thinking, this is a much different Mississippi than when I arrived here in '89. There's just changes have happened here. And I realize they have around the country as well, but Mississippi obviously is probably the state that's had the furthest to come in terms of these kinds of things.
And in the book, when you describe your beginnings as an investigative journalist in Mississippi, you grew up in Texas near the Arkansas border, but Mississippi still seems to emerge as a kind of distinct place. It's not, as probably many Northerners would say, it's the South, it's the deep South. You're characterizing it as different in significant respects. Can you recall, were you at all curious when you began living in Mississippi and working there? Did you ever look at the way the history of Reconstruction, segregation, civil rights movement were being told in the books for the?
Oh, you're talking about the way it's told in history books? Oh my goodness!
Yeah, especially the
Texas too. Yeah, in Texas too. I grew up with that. I grew up with that.
Okay.
Oh, Reconstruction was terrible. Oh, it was awful. the scalawags and the carpetbaggers, and ooh, it was awful. And finally, we drove them out, and yay, the South, the South won. So it was kind of like, I don't know that they used the Klan as a reference, but it was kind of like Birth of a Nation, kind of this. I don't know if people are familiar with that reference, but it was basically almost a Klan propaganda film that came out in 1915, but it was responsible for the resurrection of the Klan essentially in 1915. But yeah, Reconstruction. I mean, Mississippi. They up through the 60s, and I've got a copy of this textbook. Up through the 1960s, basically, students in Mississippi were taught that that the Klan rescued the South. I mean, that was in a textbook, for public schools in Mississippi. So yeah, I mean, it remained in textbooks for a very long time. And you can understand, if you kind of understand that, you begin to understand why people had that mentality. I mean, there was somebody at the 2005 trial get up and testify and talk about what a great organization the Klan was, and he was a Baptist preacher, a local Baptist preacher. It was just like, really, you really think this? So it was it's really fascinating. And I think the other thing I'd like to say about Mississippi, and no one asked this question, but I'm gonna volunteer it, is I think it's real easy to point a finger at Mississippi and think that we're not America, instead of recognizing that Mississippi and what Mississippi's gone through is America, if that makes any sense. Like, this is all of our past. For example, since I'm speaking to you in New York City, one of the biggest racial massacres in United States history happened in New York City. And you probably have heard of the draft riots. You may be familiar with the draft riots. You probably have heard about that. And of course, Martin Scorsese did a film, Gangs in New York, and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people don't know about what followed the draft riots, which was this horrible massacre of Black Americans that lived in, believe it or not, Manhattan. So I'm curious about that. If someone is interested in letting me know, I'd be curious about that, because I, from what I understand, there's not even a historical marker there. And I just think that's astounding. I mean, we have historical markers all over Mississippi now, beginning to mark these places. And I think what I guess I'm trying to say is, this is the way Murley ever said it, and I think it's a good way to think about it. And this is her perspective, not mine, is it was easier to deal with racism in Mississippi than it was up north, because if somebody was racist in Mississippi, they would be racist to your face. Whereas up north, someone may shake your hand and stab you in the back. So that was the way she said it. So I think it's easy to let Mississippi be, for lack of a term, be a scapegoat, instead of being willing to look at our own states and our own communities and all these other things, honestly.
That's a very important point, Jerry. Thank you for making that. That's really worth reflecting on. Related to that, I wanted to ask, is it your sense, because you spoke about it in this evening's lecture, and I learned of your work initially through the documentary film Neshoba, which I've shown to students at King's. Students like it very much. I strongly recommend the film. You're featured prominently in Neshoba, deservedly so. You spoke about reconciliation tonight. Reconciliation is an important part of the story in the documentary film Neshoba. What role do you see now in Mississippi and elsewhere in the United States for churches with respect to racial reconciliation, in part because we know that sometimes racial hatred is grounded in references to the Christian faith?
Well, the Klan claim they're a Christian organization. A lot of these white supremacist groups claim they're Christian. the churches were certainly the place where first slavery and then segregation was justified, and so we have to be willing to own that and to own our history. I think that's part of the problem is that we don't know our history, and that's why we're repeating it. And I think that's why I'm not just, yeah, of course I'm going to say read my book, but I think that's something my book can help with, is not that it's a be all and end all that history, but I've gotten a bunch of emails from people saying, I had no idea all these things took place, black and white. And I think until we know that history, we do until we understand and know our history, we keep repeating it. And so I think the churches can play an incredibly important role. It's the churches certainly in the South remain very strong, very much a part of the fabric of the South, and I think around the country as well, and certainly places of worship, whatever synagogues or mosque or whatever. I mean, I think can play that role as well. That we need to step forward and take a stand against racism. And I'm grateful to see, I know some of the Christian colleges I'm familiar with have been willing to step forward now and kind of be more honest about their own past and say, hey, we didn't do the right thing during this period of time. I know where my dad went to college, they had a petition to try to admit black students in the 1950s. And my dad was among the students who signed for that. And I, and that's, but we need to have that. We need to recognize, all those things in our history in order to take steps toward reconciliation. Because until we understand that, we can't reconcile until we know the truth, right? Absolutely. And so that's why it's important.
Absolutely. Here's another interesting question about journalism. As a white male, have you found that people such as the former Klansmen you interviewed were more willing to speak with you and to be open with you? And how can non-white journalists report on social justice issues, especially racism, with the same depth that you do?
It's a great question. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it's just like if I believe there was a documentary years ago, not that many years ago, it's called Two Towns of Jasper. And what they did is actually sent out two separate film crews. They sent out a white film crew into the white community, and they sent a black film crew out into the black community to try to really get a sense of what was happening there. And I'm not saying that's the answer, but how can you, as a person of color, whatever, I think, well, the beauty right now is the telephone, right? I can't help but think of the Spike Lee film, right? Black Klansmen, where the Klansmen were convinced this black guy was in the Klan, So that's the beauty of the phone right now. You can talk all day, and obviously they can ask you, but that's one of the ways to do it. But I think if you're honest and you're fair, I mean, at least I hope so. I mean, these guys are, the thing is, they're so horribly racist, and they're also, hate women too and everything else. I mean, they're pretty awful people. Yeah, I definitely had an advantage being a white Southerner going in, with my background and having gone to Christian college and other things like that Beckwith actually asked me about. And, but I passed with flying colors all his questions because, he asked me where I went to church, for example, and things like that. So, yeah.
I recall that in your book. And did you get asked those questions a lot?
No, actually, no. I mean, he was the only one who really asked me like that, kind of like a dozen questions about all those kinds of things. No, that was actually unusual. But most of the guys, I think, because I was white and Southern and I had the accent, were like, "Hey, come on," and I was feeding them, so they liked that too. So,
could you tell us a bit more about the near-term agenda and long-term agenda for your Center for Investigative Reporting?
Sure. You know, we're trying to write about these important issues in Mississippi, like, as I mentioned, criminal justice. We're working on a project now on domestic violence, which has been real. This is a nationwide issue, and we want to kind of get into the nationwide aspects of it later next year, later in the year, in 2021. But at least initially talk about it from a Mississippi perspective. For example, in Mississippi, you have to be convicted 3 times of a misdemeanor of domestic violence before you can be convicted of a felony. Well, that's just kind of crazy, you know. In Mississippi, you can't. Domestic violence is not a grounds for divorce. You know, that where it's like you can't divorce someone just because they beat you. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, I know, but that actually is the law in Mississippi. So there are different things like that in Mississippi that we want to write about, and then write about nationally about domestic violence, which is horrible. You know, it's the one. From what I understand, I haven't done this is anecdotal rather than I've really done any kind of study on it, but anecdotally, I know that crimes or at least arrests are down. You know, they're just not making, law enforcement hasn't been making as many arrests, and there haven't been, the prosecutors haven't been bringing as many cases, except for domestic violence. So domestic violence remains really a plague within our plague right now, that very few people have been talking about. It's gotten a little bit of coverage, but not really that much coverage. And the thing is, it happens every day and people don't realize it. It's almost every day typically a guy, he's either a ex-husband, estranged husband, ex-boyfriend, estranged boyfriend, will take a gun and will shoot his, ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, estranged wife, estranged girlfriend, and sometimes others. And this happens every day in America. And we just don't think anything about it because it's so common, if that makes any sense. It's the fact that it's so common that we don't think of it as significant. We don't think that about gang violence, right? There's a gang killing. We go, oh my, it's a gang killing. No. But if it's domestic violence, oh, that's a domestic violence. And we just kind of have a different attitude toward it, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Anyway. Also pertaining to the work of the center, are there any outstanding cold cases that you think?
We're working on one. We're working on several, actually. We've got one that's kind of a wrongfully convicted case where somebody was convicted. All right, so get this. It's one of those rare, what they call no body cases, where there's not a body. Okay. So there's not a body. And then number 2, the only evidence they had was supposedly blood that was found, but it wasn't sampled until 3 weeks later. And so they didn't have complete DNA. It was just mitochondrial DNA. And with mitochondrial DNA, sometimes you can only narrow it down to like 40,000 people. It's not like regular DNA, where you'd be able to define it much better. Kind of more like a fingerprint. But with mitochondrial, it's not that way. You only have part of the DNA. And then the other part of that is the main witness against this that led to this guy's conviction was so mentally ill, they had to postpone the trial 6 times. He's suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And so serious mental illness that this guy was being treated for. And yet he was the main witness against this guy. So it's very fascinating. It's very interesting case. So that's one we're working on right now. And we've got a cold case. We've got some interns coming in, hopefully to work with us this summer, a cold case from the 1970s that I think is pretty fascinating. There was a conviction of one guy in it, but not the others. So I'm kind of intrigued by that one. We'll see where that one goes.
Okay. There's a
And I'm also working on another cold case too. I forgot. Don't laugh. Don't laugh too hard, everybody. I'm working on the cold case in Tiger King. So that's the other one I'm working on.
Okay. This is a more specific question, and maybe Jerry, you could repeat for the audience about how they can get in touch with you.
Sure.
Somebody's interested in knowing whether you'd be willing to speak at a high-level virtual United Nations event in February.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, sign me up. That sounds cool.
Okay. All right. Why don't I ask my colleague, esteemed colleague Paul Glatter, if he has some questions for you.
Sure.
I think we've got some good questions from the journalists in the audience, but I'm sure Paul can pose even more.
All right.
Yeah, I was actually sending mine along to David, so
you may be out of questions. All right.
Yeah, and I'm not getting the text, but I think maybe it'd be nice for people who are not familiar with the nonprofit journalism.
Sure, model. Talk about that. Yeah.
Well, to explain how it's different than newspapers, or where your stories go, how they get surfaced when you break a new big major story.
Yeah. That's a great question. So what we do with our nonprofit is we do have a website. It's MississippiCIR.org. But the main thing is we don't consider ourselves a destination site. So we share our stories. So our stories have run on the front page of USA Today. They've run in The Guardian in London, ProPublica. We worked with them for a year. And the main thing for us, which is important from a Mississippi perspective, is our stories run in almost every major newspaper in Mississippi. So we seed them out through the Mississippi Press Association. So the Tupelo paper, which is actually basically most of Northeast Mississippi, they publish it. We have the Meridian newspaper that publishes, the Jackson Clarion Ledger, which is statewide. We've got Mississippi Today, which is statewide online or publication. The Natchez, Mississippi newspaper, and others too. And so we certainly send our stories out to all. They've got over 100 members, and so those stories run literally in those newspapers across the entire state. And to me, that's I worked for the Clarion Ledger for many, many years, but that's really better. It's really a bigger megaphone, or whatever you want to think of it, than I would have had that if I'd still been at the Clarion Ledger, in terms of getting the message out, making a difference, having more people read the story, which is what you want in terms of investigative reporting has an impact. And so that's what we're trying to do is have an impact. And so we want to seed it out to as many people as possible and get as many news organizations as possible to run it. And this, starting in January, we're going to be part of a Microsoft pilot news project. So it'll be us and the Clarion Ledger, Mississippi Today, and Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and Jackson Advocate. And we're all going to be working together on a couple of different projects together, or actually more than two probably. But anyway.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And there's a lot of concern in the journalism industry, as you know, I think around what we call news deserts. And so what happens?
Yeah, we're considered the news desert, so that's why we're getting this money. So.
Oh, Mississippi as a state. Yeah, and what curious to hear your thoughts on nonprofit journalism is one perhaps answer on news deserts. And from your vantage point there in Mississippi, are there other solutions? It seems like a lot of philanthropic money is flowing to try to get at that problem of just communities.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah, I think that's the answer. I mean, is to for foundations and others basically has stepped up where for-profit journalism is kind of falling apart at this point in various places and various forms. It doesn't mean it won't still exist in some form, but it's just not been a model that's really working right now. Financial model I'm talking about, at least for the long term. So that's why I think the nonprofit is much more viable. So that's what we're doing. We're going to foundations and we're getting money from them and others and things like that. We got the Pulitzer Center backed our Poverty in the Pandemic project, and we just got a pretty good grant from, I can't say who yet because they're not allowing us to say yet, but we got a pretty good grant from a 6-figure grant from a reputable foundation, and we continue to kind of go around and do that kind of work.
Jerry, there's another question about your methods as a journalist, and it has to do with the fact that you interviewed many people. And the question is, do you have a series of go-to questions that you use when interviewing people that you would recommend other journalists use with some frequency?
Well, it depends on what you're doing with the interview. I mean, you know, you want to make the person comfortable. I think that's really important. B, it depends on the interview. But I always think if you're trying to, like, let's say you're profiling a person, you're trying to really dig down and find out what this person is like, whether it's a Klansman or whoever it is, CEO, I mean, it doesn't matter who. You want to really dig into and find out what they're about, and a lot more, try to read as much as you can about them before you show up for the interview. And that'll help you immensely in that. And then you always start with, you know, you want to find out about their lives. I mean, I always think that's important, and people want to talk about their lives typically, you know, how they grew up, what it was like, you know, what inspired them to do what they did. So I think that's always a great way to start, is kind of talk about their life and get them to talk about that. I know that's what I do with the Klansmen. I mean, I would get them to just tell me about their lives. You know, what was it like growing up in, you know, in Birmingham, or, you know, wherever it was, you know, and get them to talk about it.
I was struck in reading your book by how often you went back and read old Mississippi newspapers. You read occasionally obscure books, you know, white supremacist books,
I did.
explaining different aspects of the white supremacist worldview. But I also had the sense that you, without really drawing attention to it, you read a lot of history books about history of Reconstruction, start of segregation, campaigns to keep blacks from voting in the South.
I did. I read a tremendous number of history books. Thank goodness. Yeah, that was what helped me to be able to piece the puzzle together and to write the book. I mean, that's what I tried to do within the book as well, is to, even though it's a kind of told as a detective story, a first person, you know, detective story along the lines of All the President's Men, it's also embedded within that. It's got the kind of this history spine within it that hopefully is helpful to people in understanding the history of the United States. In terms of like Reconstruction, and the fact that, as you pointed out about the 15th Amendment, I mean, even though it went into place, Reconstruction, once it ended, I mean, that was pretty much it. And what people don't realize is, like, the 1890 Constitution of Mississippi was instituted for the express purpose of disenfranchising Black Americans. I mean, they said this out loud. It's not like this was any kind of secret. They said it was to reestablish white supremacy. And then the Mississippi flag was adopted 4 years after that. And then of course the Confederate Statues came after that. So I think people, if you want to understand that history, that kind of sheds a whole different light on that history. Whereas those statues didn't go up in the 1860s or the 1870s. These didn't go up, a lot of them, most of them, until after 1900. And so they're part of that reestablishment or reassertion of white supremacy. And again, that's their words, and not even my own. So
I tell my students in the constitutional law course that it seems to me that the death knell of Reconstruction is the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court blesses, in a sense, legally mandated segregation.
Well, and a year before that is when they blessed the Mississippi Constitution.
Yep. So very important. If I can say something about Paul's program at King's, because I think it agreeable. The major that Paul helped put together is humanities and journalism. And at King's we have a core curriculum consisting of courses in politics, economics, philosophy, history, religion, and so forth. Paul, would you like to say anything about the major to Jerry, just as like a reference point for maybe aspiring journalists who might be in the
Sure.
audience?
Sure.
Well, yeah, I think David made a good point about it, which was we wanted to create a major where students can learn the journalism skills in a way, even when the technology is shifting, the skills matter, but also the knowledge base of liberal arts and humanities are there. And we also have a program called the NYC Semester in Journalism, or NYCJ for short, that 41 different universities, colleges and universities around the country send students to us each fall and spring, where we place those students in newsrooms in New York. And to us, it's important to bring, some geographic diversity to newsrooms and ethnic diversity, all kinds of diversity, because we're in this weird dynamic where so much of the nation's media and the hiring in journalism is happening in New York, maybe DC, New York, San Francisco.
Right.
And it's hard for reporters, if you came from this part of the country, to understand Mississippi or South Dakota or wherever else. So we're trying to help create some flow between.
Well, if any of them ever have any interest in working for us even remotely, let us know. We'd like to, obviously try to get some grants along with that. But anyway, that would be great.
We'll take you up on it, Jerry. In fact, one of my alumni told me she went to your high school and you were the editor of the high school paper. She was editor of it. We have a few students from Texarkana, I believe.
Oh my goodness. Well, I would probably, I'm sure I'd know if she was there around when I was there, I would know her. But anyway.
Oh, no, many years after you.
Oh, many years after me. Okay. Yeah, I was the editor of that illustrious newspaper known as the Tiger Times.
We
all get our start. That's great.
So Jerry, our time is kind of winding down. Any thoughts you'd like to share with the audience before we say goodnight? Any concluding thoughts?
No, the only thing I'd say to you, to the young journalists, is sometimes people ask me what's the most important thing as a journalist to remember, or, if there's one piece of advice. Yeah, sometimes people ask it that way. Well, one piece of advice for journalists, what would it be? And it would be never give up. I mean, to be persistent, and this is whether you go into journalism or not, because, and you see it in my book. I mean, if you remain persistent, it's amazing what the things that happen. And I certainly think as people, those of us of faith certainly understand that in terms of faith and prayer and those kinds of things. And I'll say this as a person of faith is, I knew from my own reading that God is a God of justice. And so I knew that he loved justice, and that kind of helped drive me as well. And I kind of wrote a little bit about that, about praying for justice in the three civil rights workers case. And so, these are, I think these kind of things help us, as Christian journalists, we kind of, for lack of a better term, I think we have a leg up in a sense on people who maybe don't ascribe to faith, because we believe in such a thing called truth. We believe in such a thing called justice. It's not just who you know. There is such a thing as truth. There are such things as facts. So I think that it really helps us in terms of our worldview, does help us and guide us in that journey.